Life for All presents Daily Food series, The Word of Life, The Fellowship of Life, and Living Stones for the Edification. The Epistles of John and Peter. Title of Book 5, The End is Near, by Pedro. Week 1, The Shepherd and Overseer of Your Souls. Friday, the examples of David and the Lord Jesus. Read with prayer. And when he had removed him, he raised up from them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. Acts 13, verse 22. We have already seen that Saul disobeyed God's orders and as a consequence lost the kingdom. The Lord then chose David to be king. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. Samuel went to Jesse's house as the Lord had commanded him. When he saw Jesse's sons, he thought that one of them would be God's chosen one. But the Lord said to him, Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Verse 7. Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel, but the Lord chose none of them. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10. However, David remained, whom Jesse had not bothered to call. Verse 11. David was a teenager at the time, and perhaps for that reason, his father had forgotten him. Unlike the others, he was tending sheep. Samuel demanded that they send for him, and the Lord ordered Samuel to anoint David. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. Verses 12 and 13. This is a principle. When God anoints someone, the Spirit takes possession of him to carry out his work. Upon discovering that David had been anointed king in his place, Saul began to persecute him and tried to kill him. David knew that he could not oppose him, since Saul was an authority appointed by God, and he began to flee from his presence. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10. In contrast, David once had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he did not do it. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 3 through 6. He only cut off the hem of Saul's robe, and his conscience was troubled. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. Verse 6. The Lord had already rejected Saul and anointed David, but Saul was still on the throne. David recognized that only God and no one else could deal with Saul. Because he understood and respected spiritual principles, David was a man after God's own heart. Acts chapter 13, verse 22. The principle applies to us as well. There can be no rebellion in our heart against the one who has been anointed by the Lord. David had another opportunity to kill Saul, but he did not do it either. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 7 through 11. At that time, Abishai offered to kill Saul, but David said, Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please, take now the spear and the jug of water that are by his head, and let us go. Verse 9 and verse 11. From this we learn that only the Lord can deal with the one anointed by him. Even if an authority figure is doing something wrong, we must believe that in due time God will deal with him or her. Let us not be the ones who dare to raise our hand against someone commissioned with authority by God, for such an attitude will be considered rebellion. The Apostle Peter confirms this in his first letter. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. Chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. Peter admonished Jewish believers who lived as servants in Gentile nations. Servants must be submissive to their masters. In other words, employees must be submissive to their bosses. Even if the boss is unjust, the principle does not change. We must remain in a position of submission. This does not mean that we must agree with the injustices committed against us or others, but we must trust the Lord to give us deliverance in his time. The Lord Jesus came to earth voluntarily, assuming the position of a servant, and left us this important lesson. He did not cling to his position as God. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Such an attitude shames Satan, who always acts in the opposite way, wanting to climb to the farthest sides of the north and to be equal to the Most High. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 through 15. God allowed Jesus to suffer humiliation, insults, physical aggression, and finally, the worst death on the cross. Even so, the Lord Jesus did not complain, but was obedient to the end. Philippians chapter 2, verse 8. We should all have the same feeling and attitude, because we are on earth to be servants. We are servants of the Lord and also of all the brothers and of the people who are on the streets. As servants, we do not demand recognition. While many work in air-conditioned environments, colporteurs go out into the streets and are exposed to temperature variations to preach the gospel. Even so, they do not demand recognition or special treatment because they are servants. In the book of Isaiah, we read a prophecy about the suffering of the Lord Jesus as a servant. He shall grow up before you as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken and smitten by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Chapter 53, verses 2 through 5 and verse 7. In the Gospel of Mark, Some of the hardships that befell the Lord Jesus before his crucifixion are recounted. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palm of their hands. Chapter 14, verse 65. The Lord endured all this for us as a servant because he loved us. Finally, as recorded in Isaiah, he saw the labor of his soul and was satisfied. Chapter 53, verse 11. The Lord Jesus is our best example of a servant.